If you've played any shooter games released in the last 20 years or so, you're probably familiar with the concept of hipfiring, which is when you shoot without aiming down the sights, right? Well, let me ask you something. How many games have you played where you actually see characters holding their guns by their hips? Turns out what's called hipfiring in games doesn't usually involve firing from the hip. Gamer lingo can often be inaccurate. Gamers tend to be enamored with certain terms that might not be technically accurate, but get the idea across, with terms that sound cool being especially favored. This is why games like Warcraft have tanks. It's not because there's a treaded armored vehicle with a giant turret on your team drawing aggro. It's because you have a character with a high defensive capability, so why wouldn't you call him a tank? Or why we use the term strafing. This was originally a German word that came to refer to low-altitude attacks by aircraft. It started to be used in games like Doom because, well, not only does it sound cool, but circling around an enemy firing at them while in fast motion kind of evokes the imagery of an agile plane aggressively striking a static ground target. Now, the usage of the term strafing has broadened to the point that it usually refers to any lateral movement at all, shooting or not. This usage of the term has become so widespread that I've heard the term used to refer to lateral movement entirely outside the context of video games. You can see how a term appropriated for gaming can follow a very strange and unpredictable course. Usually, terms are more subject to this kind of linguistic development when they're not really self-descriptive. Strafing, for instance, is a foreign word, so it doesn't really have a hard set meaning in English. It can mean anything. Likewise, if you introduce the term tank to the context of a medieval-style warrior using swords and magic, then tank can refer to whatever you want as long as it has some vague connotation of toughness. But hipfire is a self-descriptive term, and it doesn't leave much to the imagination, so you'd expect something a game refers to as hipfiring to entail a character holding a weapon low by the hip, but not many games actually feature this. Most of the time, what's referred to as hipfire in video games is actually shoulder fire, with the weapon up by the face. In most games, weapons that have a stock will always have it shouldered while in use. To aim down the sights in these cases isn't to have the weapon go from hip to shoulder, rather the character makes a small adjustment to have an already shouldered weapon get those sights aligned with the eye. Firing with a weapon shouldered but not aimed is a legitimately valid way to use a weapon sometimes, just not exactly what I'd call hip firing. I'm going to talk in more detail about what's going on here later, but for now I'll focus on analyzing the first-person dimension specifically. To outline this issue of hip firing from a first-person perspective, I must make one key fact clear from the outset. First-person view models are a lie. They're just straight up wrong. They don't really make sense. Whatever is supposed to be happening to your character in a video game, first-person view models are a fairly distorted representation of it that very rarely lines up with what another player observing the same action would see. This is because most of what goes into first-person view models is a necessary gameplay contrivance for the benefit of the player. When you need to see what weapon you have out, you don't really have the tactile feedback of holding it or anything like that. You only see it on the screen. Visual feedback is your primary means of interfacing with the world of a video game, and in a shooter, your weapon is your primary means of affecting that world. So it's something that you want to have in sight at all times. And if it's out of sight, well, it's out of mind. Seeing the weapon in your character's hands is much more effective visual feedback than, say, having a little icon that might serve the same purpose. Have you played any FPS games that don't have first-person weapons modeled? Technically, not much is different. The same information might be conveyed via some icon or text, and you actually have better visibility since your weapon isn't obstructing your view, but for reasons that are hard to articulate, it feels unpleasant. It's disorienting, it's hard to acclimate to, and it's easy to get confused in hectic moments if you're switching weapons back and forth. Thus, in video games, your primary means of knowing your weapon and its state of readiness is to look at what you see in your character's hands. And this creates a problem because realistically there are a lot of reasons why you might not be able to see your character's hands or what is held therein. Take for instance that if your character was actually holding the weapon at the hip. If first-person view models were spatially consistent, your hands would probably be well below the minimum vertical field of view that you get in most games. And that would be bad since your weapon, the tool by which the player interacts with the world around them, would be out of sight and mind, possibly for an extended period of time. To keep the visuals conducive to gameplay, the range of height that the character's hands are allowed to travel in first-person view must stay within your field of view most of the time. A consequence of this is that you're not going to have a satisfying, realistic way to show in first person the full range of motion you would expect between hip firing and shouldering a rifle. It's just not possible to adhere to the conventional first person perspective while doing that. But I'm not just going to blow off what we see in first person view models entirely. After all, they do tend to come with much more intricate and detailed animations, even if they can't necessarily line up with how a real person would move in every way. It won't hurt to consider them a little more closely before outright dismissing them. Let's suppose first-person view models do have a say, and they do establish a deeper truth about our weapon's positioning. Even from the first-person perspective alone, it's hard to reconcile most first-person games as having your character actually be hip-firing, because usually the ADS animation looks almost entirely like horizontal motion to get those offset sights aligned with the player's perspective, presumably while the weapon's already shouldered. That movement would actually align pretty closely with the character going between an unaimed, shouldered stance to aiming down the sights with the slight adjustment, but not consistent with a substantial vertical traversal for the weapon. So the only reasonable interpretation of this from the first-person view is that what's happening in most of these games isn't hipfire. It's starting to look like hipfire is a misnomer. But as I said earlier, first-person view models don't tell the whole story and can be highly misleading. So let's proceed with the assumption that the third-person perspective is a generally better representation of what your character is actually supposed to be doing, and let's see what those third-person views can show us. To lay things out clearly, when I talk about hipfire, I'm not talking about stuff like top-down shooters or side-scrollers, like say where you get a 2D sprite of Contra hipfiring or something like that. I mean games where there's a mechanical dichotomy between two principal modes of aiming down sights and what's colloquially called hipfiring. With that caveat established, true-to-form hipfiring is actually extremely rare in video games. Third-person shooters aren't so tricky because whether your character is actually firing from the hip is something you can tell at a glance, but first-person games obfuscate the issue by leaving what your character would look like from an observer's perspective to the imagination in most cases. So I'm going to demonstrate the issue with a couple of split-screen and dual-recorded examples. When you look at these kinds of games, Call of Duty, Battlefield, basically any FPS with ADS mechanics, which is a vast majority by this point, the weapon is always shouldered from an outside perspective. Most of the time, your character never ever is seen to hip fire. Although what is interesting is you can usually still tell when another player is aiming down the sights. It's a subtle distinction, but in almost every case, there is a different third-person animation there for when a character's aiming down sights. The footage is going to carry its weight for this particular point. You can see that the weapon is clearly not going all the way from hip to shoulder and back. Rather, from the observer's perspective, ADSing looks like holding the weapon a little more tightly, bracing it more closely against the body, and raising the sights up to the eye. It's such a small adjustment that the movement speed penalty from aiming down sights is probably a more prominent giveaway if you were ever trying to tell if somebody was aiming or not than the animation difference in almost any situation. So what then should we call this hipfire thing if it doesn't actually seem to be hipfire in first nor third person? Well, you could call it shoulder fire, but aiming down sights properly is also a form of shouldered fire. You could call it point shooting, but hipfire is also a form of point shooting. This stance is in sort of a limbo where there isn't really an apt term I can think of that describes it specifically and concisely. You'd have to somewhat awkwardly describe it as shouldered point fire or something really descriptive like that. That's kind of unwieldy, right? And now we can see why the term hipfire is so much more popular and prevalent than a more accurate term might be. There's not really a short catchy name for what's going on in these games, and the term hipfire is very concise, clear, and evocative compared to calling it anything else. And everyone understands what this firmly established word conveys in a gaming context, as opposed to if you suddenly introduced some other term that might be more technically accurate. It's just funny to me that the term has become so universally applied, while being self-demonstrably wrong, and is almost never what's actually happening. And its common use among players extends beyond games that even have ADS mechanics in the first place. Take for instance this Halo article that describes Halo as a great display of how much more fun it is to play games that only have hipfire as opposed to ADS mechanic defined games where you have to come to a halt and aim down your sights to be able to hit anything. And I don't mean to demean this article or anything, it's a fine article with an opinion that I think is well presented. It's just that the thesis isn't pertinent to this video. Instead, what's relevant here is the framing that this article is built on, with this unstated assumption that hipfiring is the default. Hipfiring is what is happening in any game where you, the player, are using a gun without seeing a first-hand look down the sights, so it goes. This author is absolutely not alone in this usage of the term. I'm not trying to single him out or anything. Plenty of examples out there, and you've probably heard it yourself too. Yeah, people often say Halo is a game with hipfiring, and only hipfiring since there's no ADS. Scoped weapons are kind of a different issue. And people say the same of games like Half-Life, Counter-Strike, Bioshock, or even games like Quake. These are all games that are oft described as hipfire-based shooters of sorts if the subject ever comes up, which it doesn't very often, to be fair. And it's all because they share this lack of a general ADS functionality that they're described this way. However, the manner in which the characters actually hold their weapon in Halo and a lot of other ADS-less games is usually the same way that hipfiring works in Call of Duty and Battlefield, which is to say, it's actually shoulder fire. In some cases, you can see your character is actually shouldering the weapon and aiming through the sights basically all the time. So I think in many of these cases, the presumption is that the character is aiming through the sights. That's just not reflected in the player's view because these games don't happen to have ADS mechanics, and you don't want to have sights obstructing the player's view all the time, so they kind of abstract the player's aiming with a convenient reticle under the assumption that the character is in fact aiming. I kind of think of it as a left eye perspective while the right eye is being used to look through the sights. That doesn't completely line up with what you'd see from that perspective, but it's satisfying enough for me. What's funny is that many of these games have absolutely no pretense of hipfiring at all. They don't even use the term themselves most of the time, because there are not two nominal ways of shooting. The term hipfiring is applied by us players because, as I said, it's seen as the default, even when that's not what's happening at all. Look at the case of Halo, where almost every gun is shouldered all the time. The logic in that case is that there's supposedly no need to aim down sights because it's the future. You have this link between your helmet and the weapon to see where it's pointing, which is why a lot of the weapons don't have sights to begin with. Nevertheless, your character still holds the gun to the shoulder in a point shooting stance, not too different from that of a soldier aiming down sights, because that's the most mechanically effective way for a human to handle a rifle type weapon. It's got a stock, might as well use it. Holding a rifle like that without aiming down the sights is a totally valid way to shoot in the real world, especially if you have tracers or something. Maybe a laser, especially if you have night vision goggles and an IR laser mounted on your gun aligned with the barrel. Even without those fancy features, point shooting by instinctual proprioception can be a lifesaver up close. It's a legit thing. There are some weapons in particular for which full-blown hipfiring is actually doctrinally correct in the real world. Machine guns, especially the heavier general-purpose machine guns like the M240, tend to be too heavy and especially front-heavy to be practically hoisted up to your shoulder and fired accurately without any support, and hip-firing them is much less physically intensive. Aiming might seem like a problem with this stance as the sights are nowhere near your eyes, but since you're generally firing tracers out of a machine gun, sights aren't necessarily crucial. Tracers provide a very reliable aiming reference, much better than a laser, which isn't something many games account for when determining hipfire accuracy. Despite the fact that hip firing isn't generally the right way to use, say, a smaller rifle, it would be really hard for even a fairly strong guy to keep such a weapon shouldered and ready for such long periods of time as your video game protagonists opt to do. And there are plenty of unusual reasons that a real person might fire in a hip firing stance with good cause on some odd occasion. Hip firing as a term is stereotypically associated with cowboys, probably for quick draw and hammer fanning purposes. The analogy, firing from the hip, is used to compare someone's actions to those of the reckless, impulsive methods of a cowboy in a duel, where the first shot means everything and you don't have time to line up your sights. Not only that, but hip firing would also be associated with people who are simply poorly trained and ignorant enough to just hold a weapon outright wrongly. So I think there's an innate connotation of recklessness and unprofessionalism with the term and the image, and this contrasts heavily to where you see video gaming represent hip firing, as it's a mechanic most associated with military-themed first-person shooters, and it's in this context that I assume developers are especially reluctant to actually animate hip firing. In a game that's supposed to be a serious military shooter about serious military cool guys killing each other, they don't want the look of the game to be evocative of reckless cowboys, ignorant gangsters, or clueless novices. They don't want the cool guy fantasy to be marred through representation by characters who seemingly don't know how to hold a gun. No matter how real this tactic may be, any Rambo-style weapon handling just looks really unprofessional, and that isn't how developers want their protagonists to appear. They want them to look cool, calculating, and awesome. These protagonists are often in Delta Force or SEALs or some other elite unit, so from a design standpoint they should look like they're fully in control and doing everything in the coolest way ever. When you think about it, your character in FPS games is technically in hipfire mode upwards of 90% of the time. You aren't in like a low ready state of holding the weapon, you're in straight up, pointing it forward, ready to shoot mode. Imagine if that was actually animated like hipfire, where everyone held the weapon at the hip in these games for all the time they spend in hipfire mode. Anytime they're not fighting, anytime they're just moving around, everyone would be holding the weapon at the hip. You know what that would look like? It would look like a bunch of airsofters goofing around. So I figure a desire to keep the characters looking professional and avoiding Rambo-fication of firearms handling is a big part of why the so-called hipfire is actually animated as shoulder fire in so many games in your tactical military first-person shooter experience. This sort of shouldered point shooting still looks good enough while fulfilling the desperate close-range reaction shooting role. It keeps all the characters looking nice and professional in their handling of weapons, even at their most desperate. To lend myself some credence, let's look at Counter-Strike. The ragtag, unscrupulous terrorist player team is seen to hipfire constantly in third person, whereas the professional, official, cool guy counter-terrorists hold the weapons shouldered in a more professional-looking way. Of course, the first-person view models show the weapons being held identically regardless of which team you're on, showing us exactly how reliable they are to deduce what is and is not actually hipfiring. But the point is, this was a conscious choice. They animated it both ways and distinguished teams by this method. That was done with a purpose. It was not a cost-saving measure or anything. It's the game telling us which of these people are pros who do things by the book and which of these people are freeform and likely poorly trained. That doesn't mean it's never a resource issue though, because having a very similar stance between aiming down sights and the so-called hip firing makes animating differences between the two, and actually programming bullet trajectories out of the two stances require only a few minor tweaks compared to what you'd have to account for with actual hip firing. Consider that going between hip firing and aiming down sights is something players expect to happen very quickly. If you had the weapon shouldered already, that would indeed be a very snappy motion, but if the weapon was actually first held down at the waist, then raised to the shoulder, then had to have its sights aligned to the eye, there would be a huge range of motion for something gamers expect to occur in a fraction of a second. As far as technical issues go, the most important one is probably that having hipfire be true to form could adversely affect gameplay. Bullets would have such a huge deviation in their point of origin between ADS and hipfire. Discrepancies would potentially confuse either the shooter or an observer. A great way to avoid this problem is to do what games already do and have the gun be held in the same general place all the time. A lot of this is speculative though. I don't know what the technical motives might be. I was just surprised at how few instances there are of hip firing actually occurring, especially when the games themselves use the term hipfire. With the overwhelmingly popular term being inaccurate, it's hard to get any answers searching online, because if for some reason you wanted to find some game where a character actually fires a weapon from the hip, it would be hard for any search you can conceive to distinguish this from just any first-person shooter with ADS mechanics. It isn't a distinction that people articulate enough for what has been written on the subject to be distinguishable. It's not like I have a problem with hip firing or the name. It's an apt name for the concept. I don't mean to sound like I'm losing sleep over this or anything. It's just that the prevailingly inaccurate usage of the term has muddled things a bit, and that makes it harder to discern hip firing as it has come to be known from actual cases of firing from the hip. So if you know of any examples that I haven't talked about or shown footage of, feel free to let me know, because I actually do find that interesting. I wouldn't have made this video if I didn't. This isn't a serious video, just a pet peeve of mine. So thank you for watching.